I would now like to introduce our presenters for tonight's meeting, Maggie Glowacki and Joel Lane. Joel is a permit leader whose primary role is reviewing construction plans for permit applications. Joel has also been reviewing projects in floodplains since the city's first floodplain ordinance went into effect in 1989. Maggie Glowacki has been with the SDCI for 20 years, focusing on environmental regulations. Maggie recently led the comprehensive update of the Shoreline Master Program adopted in 2015 and the Environmentally Critical Areas Code adopted in 2017. Currently, Maggie is leading the update to our permanent floodplain development regulations. Maggie, you now have the floor. I will give you the screen share privilege, and you should be able to go ahead and share your screen, and I will be here in the background if you need me.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you everyone for being here this evening to hear about the process that SDCI is doing to complete the floodplain development regulations update. So this evening, we're going to cover the public outreach to date, an overview of the floodplain regulations and the codes involved. We'll also cover the requirements and the role of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA, and we will be using the term FEMA this evening. We'll cover the reason for the update, FEMA's new maps, the interim regulations, our proposed changes for permanent regulations, and the timeline for the project. So the public outreach that we've completed to date include a project web page. On the web page, you'll find the interim regulations, as well as information about the process for updating the interim regulations and turning them into permanent regulations. Also on our website, we have a place where you can sign up to become a member of SDCI's email list, so you can be contacted as we go through the process. So you'll receive additional emails to hear when we have draft regulations or when we intend to be publishing SEPA on the draft permanent regulations. We've also sent out 2,400 postcards to property owners that are in the FEMA floodplain mapped areas. And to date, we have approximately 750 subscribers to our email list. So an overview of the floodplain development and regulations. Our regulations include codes that have the development standards that makes homes, businesses, and people safer from flooding. We also have mapped areas, and our mapped areas include the floodplains. So our floodplain areas are FEMA special flood hazard areas. So these are the areas identified by FEMA. We also have flood prone areas, and these are from the Growth Management Act, also known as our environmental critical areas. So we have those flood prone areas, and some of those areas, we also have areas identified by Seattle Public Utilities, and we've designated those as flood prone areas through our environmental critical areas. So our codes apply to permit applications for construction on property within these mapped areas. So the FEMA requirements, FEMA establishes the maps of the special flood hazard areas, and FEMA also has minimum required standards for our development regulations. These minimum requirements are found in the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically 44 CFR 60.3. And so within these federal regulations, they contains like where development can occur, the elevation of development measured from the expected flood elevation height, and it includes construction methods. So the reason for our update is that in February 2020, FEMA finalized updated floodplain maps for all King County. So that meant that all jurisdictions within King County were required to update our existing floodplain maps with new maps. And it also meant that we needed to review our existing regulations and update those codes to meet FEMA standards in 44 CFR 60.3. With this, this was a FEMA deadline. We were required to have our updated regulations in place by August 2020 in order to remain in compliance with FEMA. So in order to do this, we adopted interim regulations in July of 2020. So City Council adopted these interim regulations under Ordinance 126113. And then in February of 2021, we extended these interim regulations to February of 2022. So Seattle is required to have permanent regulations in place prior to the expiration of the interim regulations in February 2022. And if we don't have these permanent regulations in place, property owners within the FEMA floodplain mapped areas may not be able to purchase flood insurance or to renew their existing policies. So I mentioned the new maps. So on the right-hand side of the screen is the city of Seattle with the newly mapped areas, as well as the mapped areas from 2025 or 1995, my apologies. And so I'm going to point out the legend. So the legend shows in the areas in green are areas on land that are newly mapped. The area in blue are areas covered in water that are also mapped as floodplain areas. And the hatched areas is the overlay. So that's where the existing flood prone areas are mapped. And I'm gonna zoom into a couple areas so you can see what I'm talking about. And I also want to mention that the majority of the newly mapped areas are along the Duwamish River. So here on the screen now, you can see the east-west waterway. A lot of the new area is in the waterway itself, but then you can also see that there are some newly mapped areas that are on land in the green. And then if you look over on the right side of the screen, you can see that there are newly mapped land areas in green along the Duwamish River. And then I'm going to jump back to this screen. So there's also areas along our Puget Sound where there's newly mapped areas. So this next screen shows this area is just south of Shilshole Bay. So you can see that there are newly mapped land areas that are newly regulated under the interim regulations and will be regulated under the permanent regulations. And then over on the right-hand side, this is near Fauntleroy, and you can see that this area is on land and mapped as floodplain. So now I'm going to hand the screen over to Joel, and Joel will talk more specifically about the codes that regulate the floodplains.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm still muted. Oh,
You should be good to go there now.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. The proposed legislation we're talking about today is solely our Seattle Municipal Code, Chapter 2506, the Seattle Floodplain Regulations. However, Seattle also has code requirements for floodplains in several other codes and ordinances. These other regulations were written by different agencies and focus on different aspects of development, but our floodplain regulations in SMC 2506 ties them all together. Each of our construction codes, like Seattle's building code, existing building code, residential code, mechanical, stormwater, grading, electrical, They each have specific requirements based on the type of development those codes regulate. And in most cases, the floodplain requirements were written by nationwide organizations like the International Code Council. So Seattle is limited regarding our ability to modify those requirements. Many of those codes also reference other national standards that contain even greater detail about floodplain development, such as the American Society of Civil Engineers Standard 24 and Standard 7. All of those other codes and standards, as well as our Chapter 2506, reference FEMA's flood insurance study and the accompanying flood insurance rate maps. In case those other codes and standards don't clearly explain a requirement, FEMA also publishes many technical bulletins to help interpret those floodplain regulations. Our environmentally critical areas ordinance and our floodplain regulations describe floodplains according to FEMA's requirements, which generally use the term special flood hazard areas. Our regulations use the term flood-prone areas that also recognize areas mapped by Seattle Public Utilities. So sometimes these additional areas are not shown on FEMA's maps because they were newly mapped, and the process to update FEMA's maps can take quite a while. Other areas that might be considered too small or the flooding too shallow to warrant regulating according to FEMA standards, they still pose a risk that Seattle wishes to mitigate. An example of this is South Park, which you see here. When FEMA adopts new flood insurance rate maps, they review our regulations to make sure they comply with FEMA's requirements in Title 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the basis for the National Flood Insurance Program. In our case, FEMA found several instances where we were required to amend our floodplain regulations to stay in compliance. This included adding several definitions of terms and adding regulations for coastal high hazard zones, which didn't exist on the previous maps. We also added language that allows variances, further clarifications in our codes, and of course, now they officially refer to the 2020 maps and flood insurance study instead of the previous 1995 versions. On our website, you can find the complete list of the changes. On the website, you'll find tables like these that identify FEMA's requirements and where you'll find those requirements met in our Chapter 2506 or those other codes I mentioned earlier. And here's another example of the level of detail FEMA goes into when they're looking for compliance with our codes. One of the few changes that Seattle is including in our upcoming permanent legislation that was not in the interim regulations is the increase in the elevation requirements for flood-prone areas. So originally, Seattle required the lowest floor to be elevated a foot above the base flood elevation or 100-year flood elevation. In the 90s, we raised that to 2 feet, but we're now proposing that it be 3 feet. This will help provide additional safety as we consider the effects of climate change on more intense storm patterns and sea level rise. And importantly, it will also reduce flood insurance premiums. Another change we're proposing would allow a residential structure in a floodway, which is the most restrictive portion of a floodplain, to be replaced if it was damaged, if the Washington State Department of Ecology also approves it. This would likely be a pretty rare event. I've only seen a couple of structures where this would apply, but Seattle does have a few homes built like a bridge spanning a creek. If those homes were severely damaged by a flood, fire, or earthquake, for example, those homes could not be reconstructed in their current location with today's codes, but our proposed regulations would potentially allow that. Now, Maggie, I'll give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Joel. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So thank you, Joel. Now I'm going to talk through the timeline. So currently we're working on the public outreach portion of the update to the floodplain development regulations. So February through May of this year, we're conducting this public meeting and we'll address comments that we hear tonight. And we will continue to work with the port and private industrial, commercial, and residential property owners regarding any concerns they have or any questions that they have. So we have been receiving emails and we've been reviewing the emails and responding, and we will continue to do this through May. And we'll analyze the comments that we receive. And then we expect to have a draft of our permanent floodplain development regulations out for a published SEPA decision in June of 2021. So what this will mean is that we will have the draft out essentially for public comment. So this will give the public another opportunity to review the regulations and to provide comments. And then we will review the comments, and we expect to have final recommendations to the mayor's office in July of 2021. So that's it for the formal part of tonight's meeting. And so we will take questions, and then we also have Joel and my contact information on this slide. So you can reach out to us at any time with questions or comments. So I will hand the floor back to Daniel, and he will handle the questions for this evening.
Maggie, thank you very much. Joel, thank you. We have one person so far who has signed up to ask a question, and that is Molly Lawrence. Molly, I've found you here and unmuted you there. Molly, can you give me a mic check, please?
Sure. Hi there.
Hi, great. We can hear you just fine. Please ask us a question.
Well, I'm not sure I have any at this moment. I'm realizing I wanted to make sure I had the opportunity to ask a question. I guess the one thing that comes to mind is I'm now looking at the table, the 27-page table that's a comparison of the FEMA standards and an indication of city compliance with them. Was this table completed by FEMA so that they've done this analysis already, or is that step yet to be done? Who prepared this 27-pager?
So I'll take that. So FEMA did. So yeah, FEMA reviewed our code, and so that table indicates all the places where they had questions about our code or where we were deficient, and so we needed to make changes based on FEMA's comments. And Joel, you can add anything to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, it was a collaborative thing. So FEMA would identify where they thought we were lacking, and then we would add a code reference. Sometimes it was not in the code where they were originally looking, but
Okay.
we found it out there.
It's all green at this point, because that means that these are all the codes that you've adopted as part of the interim code in order. I assume that maybe there was an earlier version where there was red and they've subsequently turned it all green.
Right. Yeah, there were originally, I can't remember how many pages, but yes, they've agreed with our interim regulations. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Well, yeah, and to clarify there, so as Joel was mentioning, FEMA may have had something highlighted in red, but then Joel would find, where that requirement was, say, in our building code rather than in our floodplain regulations. And so we provided that information to FEMA, and that met the requirement. And so in the table, it should indicate where in our regulations that requirement is met. So it may be part of the building code.
Thanks. That's helpful.
And that's all we have currently signed up people to ask any questions. I will quickly just go ahead and maybe share this screen right here and say if anybody has any other questions, you could go down into that lower right-hand corner again and click the participant window. And in the bottom of that window is a small, tiny little raise hand function. If anybody does have any additional questions, we're certainly here to take them right now. And you could go and open that participant panel and raise your hand, and we could take your question. Laura Wolf has a question. Laura, one moment, please. Laura, I've unmuted you. A mic check, please.
Hi, thank you.
Great.
Just a quick question. If you are not releasing, I guess, any draft of the permanent floodplain regulations until the SEPA decision, are you planning on having an extended comment period?
So essentially, the draft is the interim regulations. And then the two proposed changes are what Joel went over. So the 3-foot elevation rise and the allowance that ecology would review replacement of a residential structure in the floodway. And then I actually do think we might have some kind of programmatic changes. So we potentially may have that draft regulation up, but I guess an easy way to say is that the interim regulations is a pretty complete draft of the permanent regulations. Does that make sense, Laura?
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Our next questioner is Holly Davis. Holly, one moment. Holly, I've unmuted you. Are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sounds good.
Fabulous. So I realize my question may not actually be a question to you and may actually be more of a question to FEMA, but feel free to educate me. I live in the area south of Shell Shoal where the new area was remapped. And in looking at that, it's not clear to me exactly that the mapping was done entirely accurately. There's at least one property line that clearly is not accurate. And so I'm wondering how I learn more about the process that went into drawing those lines where they are, and then if they aren't as accurate as perhaps would be good, what is the process for getting a more accurately drawn map?
There's a couple options there. So in the language of our ordinance, it does say that when the maps are unclear, we have authority to kind of interpret where the edge of the floodplain boundaries are supposed to be. And sometimes that'll be, the topography doesn't make sense with the way they mapped it. But if there's, other changes that need to be made to the floodplain maps, FEMA does have a process called a letter of map change. And that will officially change the boundaries on the maps. But if in the course of like a development permit application, we see that what's on the maps just doesn't make sense, we'll work with you on that because we know they're not 100% accurate. The coastal flood study that was done, 10 years ago, they weren't able to look at every single property and really confirm the accuracy, but they did the best they could.
Understood.
Okay.
So should I reach out to you directly? Is that the best?
Sure, you're welcome to. And I've been getting some comments from property owners that aren't even looking at doing development right now, but they're just looking at the insurance implications. So I'm working with them as well. So yeah, you're welcome to reach out to me.
Yeah, we would fall in that category. It's a condo complex and the line does not appear to make sense to me, but.
Okay, yeah, feel free to email me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
We have gotten in a follow-up question, I believe, from Molly Lawrence, and Molly's follow-up question is, and Molly, if you want to raise your hand and clarify, what analysis have you done regarding how these regulations will affect properties in the floodplain, and can you share that analysis?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. So the analysis was really based on FEMA's requirements to regulate flood-prone areas. So if in order to have flood insurance, they require us to have a certain level of protection for properties that are in those mapped floodplains. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, sorry. Not quite. So there are a number of things that are in your regulations that are no doubt out of the federal CFRs, right? Lots of things, but the things particularly that you mentioned, the 3-foot requirement for 3 foot for raising above 3 feet above the base flood is not, right, a federal requirement. And I would suspect that that's going to have a pretty significant impact on some property. So I just wondered what analysis you've done of that, or whether that's something that will be part of the SEPA process.
So we were kind of following King County's lead on that. So they're moving to a 3-foot freeboard requirement. And the more data we're getting about sea level rise and more intense storms, it really encourages us to have a higher freeboard requirement. You know, during my particular life, I may not see another foot of sea level rise, but that is likely to happen during the life of the buildings that we're issuing permits for today. So it'll buy some time while we're trying to figure out how to accommodate those other long-term changes.
And also, this might help in clarification, and Joel, please add to this, is
Sure.
that it would be for like new development or, you know, development that essentially would be considered new. So it isn't a retrofit requirement.
Right. And like if you have a home that currently is not at that elevation, flood insurance premiums are not going to be based on our requirement for 3 feet. They're going to be based on FEMA's requirement for 1 foot of elevation, for example. So if an existing structure becomes more non-conforming for our current floodplain requirements, that doesn't necessarily have an effect on the flood insurance premiums that will still be based on FEMA's minimum standards.
If anybody else, Shay, I see you've raised your hand. One moment, please. Shay, your question?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm a insurance consultant for one of these large properties in the change mapped areas. I'm wondering if there's been any discussion between you and FEMA and the NFIP program with the federal government in additional subsidization of the premiums. These, you know, with the change in flood maps, there's been these large condos that are on the water. This is a cost that they've never seen before, and is a huge pain point for the owners of the condo buildings. I'm wondering if there's been any discussion around additional subsidization of these premiums or other options for these owners of property on the Puget Sound.
We have not been part of those conversations. So FEMA specifically keeps us separate as far as the regulatory end, and we're not participating in the insurance end.
Sure.
So that's really kind of up to them.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
I have a follow-up question from Laura Wolf, and Laura's follow-up question is, how will the 3-foot sea level rise standard be incorporated into the code?
So currently we've got a section on elevation requirements, and it would be in that part of the code where if it says the lowest floor elevation has to be 2 feet, currently that would change to 3 feet for new development or substantial improvements. And
thank you. Again, if anybody has any questions, you can open the participant panel and raise your hand. If you don't have any more questions, you can also lower your hand. Holly, Shay, I believe that we have addressed both of your questions. Tess Brandon, I see you've raised your hand. One moment, please. Tess, are you there? A mic check, please.
Yeah, hi, thank you.
Great.
Hi, I'm just, I'd like to ask Maggie for clarification on her statement about the new elevation requirements applying only to what could be considered new construction. And I'm just wondering if in that umbrella, she's also considering what FEMA defines as substantial improvement. So anything, you know, over that 50% threshold.
Yeah, so I meant to include, you know, what's new or what would be considered new, and I'll pass it over to Joel. And so that's so go ahead, Joel, and explain that connection.
Sure. So in our section 2506.110, that's where our standards involving base flood elevations are. And so the language in there is specific to new construction or for substantially improved existing structures. And for FEMA's purposes, that calculation for substantial improvements is based on the cost of the development or the repairs or whatever is happening compared to the market value for the structure. So, it's a fairly easy calculation if you know what to include and what not to. And FEMA actually has giant desk references on how to do that calculation. So you wouldn't include the value of the property, you wouldn't include the value of you know, detached accessory structures, for example. But you would include, you know, all the finishes, the, you know, labor and materials for the structure. So that's how we would do the calculation for whether or not a work on an existing structure would be a substantial improvement. And if it did meet that threshold, then yes, the lowest floor would have to be 3 feet above the flood elevation rather than 2 feet as it is now.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so I apologize for any confusion that I caused over that. So Joel just explained it, you know, so I should have said new or what would be considered substantial improvement. So I just want to make sure that's clarified for the recording as well.
Shay has asked if we'll be emailing this presentation out. I don't know if we've decided that in all of our pre-production meeting. You could certainly email Maggie or Joel. Holly, did you have another question? Let me unmute you. I noticed that you did put in something into our comment form. Holly, I've unmuted you.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to clarify the last clarification Maggie made. So the 3 feet is for new construction or substantially new improvement, and then you said not the 2 foot. Is that the FEMA? Because at one point I thought they said FEMA was 1 foot.
Yeah, let me address that. So yeah, FEMA requires 1 foot as a minimum standard. They give all the local jurisdictions the authority to go above and beyond that. So for us, we changed that to 2 feet back in the 90s at some point. I forget exactly when. But that gives policyholders quite a break in flood insurance premiums. Every foot above the flood elevation, I forget the percentage. Like I said, I'm not that familiar with the insurance aspect of it, but it reduces their flood insurance premiums. So changing to 3 feet should reduce the premiums quite a bit, but it also makes those structures safer too.
Okay, sorry, I'm new to this. So the 2
Sure.
feet, when does that get invoked? When does that get used?
If someone is building a new building, then the lowest floor has to be designed to be 2 feet above the flood elevation. If someone is doing a major remodel, then that would also apply.
Got it. And then the new regulation that's on the table is to raise that 2 to 3 feet.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. I finally understand. I appreciate your patience, everyone. Thanks.
No worries.
Yeah, that's good.
Holly, thank you for your question. Again, anybody with a question that would like to ask, you could raise your hand by opening the participant button in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, or you could send it to me through the chat and I will be happy to read it for you. Well, Maggie, it seems like we have kind of plateaued on questions. Again, if anybody has any questions, you can open up the participant window and click the small raise hand icon in the lower right-hand corner, or you could send me a chat. We'll give you another moment or so, and then we will thank you for your time and attendance.
And also feel free to send Joel and I your questions as well if anything comes up. And we will have this presentation up on our website with the PowerPoint and the full presentation, or the full recording, I mean.
And with that, I thank you all for attending our floodplain regulation meeting this evening, and we will call it an evening. Have a great night, folks. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.